Hello, folks, and welcome back to Southbank Live, episode 33. This is something of an emergency episode given the grave circumstances in Ukraine and the very quite remarkable events we've seen take place in investment markets over the past few days. Now, joining me this evening is John Butler. John, welcome. It's great to have you back. We have discussed the Ukraine-Russia the potential for there to be conflict in numerous previous episodes of Southbank Live. But yeah, thanks for joining me. And once again, can we just get, could we go for something of a sit-rep report on what is going on in Ukraine at the minute? As you know, as far as you can, as it is quite hard to really know what's going on the ground there at the moment.
Look, it's extremely hard, and I don't have any privileged information. I'm reading the same headlines as everyone else, and yet perhaps I'm reading between the lines a little bit differently just because of the way I've approached this. As you say, we've discussed it before. Also, I've been following events in Ukraine ever since the 2014 revolution, coup, call it what you want, because from that point onward, it has been a tangential but nevertheless potentially important topic for investors, especially investors in Russia, in Eastern Europe, because this is the big flashpoint now between Russia and NATO, and clearly things have escalated now to the point of kinetic war. So I think I have a little bit to offer here, but the first thing I'll say is that the first casualty of war is the truth. Okay, I mean, let's just come out and say it. And I'm as aware of that as anybody. And if you are not yourself a primary source in the theater, you don't really know what's going on. So you really have to be careful, read between the lines, look at multiple sources, make sure those multiple sources are diversified. Did you notice a few days back, every single major UK paper had the same photo on the cover?
Yep, yeah, I did indeed.
Was that a coincidence? I doubt it. So you need to be concerned that the UK press may already have instructions, what they're allowed to, not allowed to report, how they're supposed to report it. And that sort of thing is normal in warfare. Now, the UK is not itself formally at war, and yet clearly we're involved here. So be careful what you read. That's my first piece of advice.
Yeah, it is very interesting to see how the media sphere has evolved along the lines of this conflict. Because the last time when we saw what was going on in 2014, with all of Russia's previous incursions, social media wasn't still quite as developed as it is today, and so broadly used. And seeing how the COVID era social media sphere and the manner in which the news is being reported has evolved to now fit a kinetic conflict has been very interesting to watch. There are so many different things that so many different avenues we could go down with this, John. One thing I would like to start with, as I mentioned earlier, we have discussed the Russia-Ukraine conflict in numerous other episodes. There will be quite a few people watching this evening or as a recording later on who won't have watched those yet. I was hoping you could just give us a little bit of backstory to what is going on there and how this conflict has emerged as it has.
Well, look, if you're a student of history, and European history to be more specific, you're well aware that Ukraine as a political entity really doesn't have much of a history. Now, nothing against the Ukrainians. They're a proud people, a proud culture. But the exception, not the rule, is them having a country of their own, a sovereign nation of their own. Ukraine has belonged over the centuries to some combination of the Austrian Empire, the Russian Empire, the Polish-Lithuanian Empire / Confederation. I forget what they called it, the Ottoman Empire, and so this period that Ukraine has enjoyed as a properly fully recognized sovereign nation post-Soviet era is relatively new in the Ukrainian experience. Now, that doesn't mean that they don't have a right to be a sovereign nation. I wouldn't suggest that for a moment. However, it does open a can of worms. And the reason why is because the borders as they exist today were drawn not only by the ways in which the various empires settled their various disputes through the years, but quite specifically the way Lenin, Stalin, and Khrushchev decided to draw and redraw the internal Soviet borders of Ukraine during their respective reigns in power. And again, nothing against the Ukrainians. Please, no one take this the wrong way, but it looks a bit awkward if you're defending borders, especially as NATO, which was the anti-Soviet alliance through the decades. It
Yep.
looks a bit odd if you're using that anti-Soviet alliance to enforce Soviet-drawn internal borders. It's logically inconsistent, and you can understand why perhaps the Russians and Ukrainians are having this dispute now. And that NATO's opinion is a very odd one in the matter. It's almost as if it's between them and NATO's involvement. Don't get me wrong. I mean, Ukraine has a right to self-defense. NATO has a right to self-defense, but it's almost as if NATO's involvement, it just looks strange in the way in which it's come about, right? NATO defending internal Soviet borders looks strange. And I think that's part of the complexity here, that the West, NATO, you and me, aren't really being well informed about, whereas the Russians and the Ukrainians themselves, of course, are deeply aware of all of this. And so they're in a much better position to have an informed opinion. Now, they may choose to fight it out. That's what's happening. But it's almost as if, we in the West aren't qualified to even talk about it or understand what's really going on here.
Yeah, once again, there's so many avenues we could go down with this. When it comes to qualified opinions and informed opinion on the subject of Ukraine, Russia's history, and the Soviet Union's history, and the manner in which the borders were arranged, that's not something I see really anywhere in the mainstream media. It's not something I think people are thinking about much, which is where these borders were and why they were in that way. Putin did, of course, speak about all of this in his 1 hour long speech, which of course barely anyone has watched because they just read the newspapers. Could you go into a little bit with what is going on with the border disputes and what its history is? Because I do feel that the manner in which this is being spoken about in the press and the manner in which it is going crazy on social media is that Putin is, of course, the big baddie. He's a James Bond villain, and he's just trying to retake all of the Soviet Union states. He wants to retake all of Ukraine and retake all of the Warsaw Pact regions, etc., etc. And I don't feel that this is a very informed, intelligent view on what it is, regardless of what your views are on Putin and, of course, his decision to invade another country and use military force.
Exactly. I mean, look, those of us who claim to live in a civilized world, civilized countries, we never like to see anything settled by military means. But clearly, it's coming to that now. Or it has come to that. I mean, hopefully, not for much longer. But why are we in this situation? I mean, look, Ukraine is a divided country. Don't get me wrong. Ukraine as a people, as a culture, is well defined. But as a country, given the way the borders were drawn and the fact that they include a lot of ethnic Russians, is less well defined in that sense. And the best evidence I have, although it's hardly definitive, just how divided Ukraine has been through the years, culturally, between the ethnic Russians and the Ukrainians, are the voting patterns that you've seen. Basically, in the South and in the East, you've consistently seen up to 80+% of the votes going to generally pro-Russian politicians, whereas in the North and in the West, you've seen nearly the opposite, 80% plus going to anti-Russian, pro-EU, pro-NATO politicians. Now we talk about the North-South divide in the UK. We talk about the blue-red divide in the US. The coast versus the flyover country, whatever you want to call it. And there are other divides elsewhere, but this divide is severe. And I think it's severe in part because the fact is people who live in this part of the world, that is Central and Eastern Europe, they have long memories because they've been battlefields. When you've lived in a battlefield, you tend to have a long memory. And Ukraine is well aware that they were, one of the primary battlefields in the Second World War. And that the country was even divided then. And at times, because obviously Stalin was not very nice to Ukraine at times, I don't want to go into too much
That's
detail,
one
but
way of
let's
putting it.
face it.
Yeah.
I mean, there was nothing good about it. Okay, and so you have these long memories, and it makes it very, very difficult now to settle those long memory disputes. I mean, ask the Serbians, who have the longest memory of all, perhaps. In any event, the fact is that the 2014 revolution occurs following a disputed election, one where clearly the ethnic Russians wanted the pro-Russian candidate to win, who did, and yet the pro-Western candidates did not. And yet this revolution takes place thereafter, and it's clearly supported by the U.S. and NATO. We have so much evidence to that effect; nobody denies it. And so yeah, when that revolution occurs, Putin immediately takes national security actions to secure Russia's Black Sea naval base in Crimea, which is a vital national security interest. I cannot stress this point more. The whole warm water port, the whole access to the Black Sea and the Bosporus is of such vital national security to Russia that, in my opinion, they will go nuclear before they allow that to be lost. I don't think that's hyperbole. I think that is absolutely positively the way they think. I think NATO probably knows that's the way they think. And the fact that Crimea was absorbed into Russia following that revolution in 2014 shouldn't have been as shocking to people in the know as perhaps the mainstream media portrayed it to be. Now we're going through round two, where Eastern Ukraine, which has never settled its territorial dispute, I mean, the Donbass and Luhansk regions, which have never settled their territorial dispute with the government in Kiev, they're now having a go of it. And yes, I'm sure that Putin has been encouraging that. And so that's where we are. And that's how this war got, kicked off. That's how it got started. And now that it's started, it's going to be very, very hard to get out of this, to negotiate a settlement. I do think there's a way forward, but sadly, people are going to have to get killed before we're going to have fruitful negotiations to de-escalate this.
You're going to have to elaborate on that for us, John. I think. I mean, that's very sounds very ominous indeed.
It is ominous. It is ominous. So again, Russia has been, in theory, prepared for war to protect Crimea and the Black Sea Fleet ever since 2014. The Minsk agreements, which were reached to try to settle the disputes in the Donbass region, southeast Ukraine, um, look, they just never worked. They just never worked. There has still been very low intensity conflict along those borders ever since, and the Russians have lost patience, and for that matter, I suppose the Ukrainians have too, and so they're going to fight it out. So, in order to get everyone to the negotiating table and to get them to the negotiating table in good faith, hopefully reasonably good faith, both sides are really going to have to stare into the abyss here, and that, I think, is what's happening tonight. I think as we speak, I think there is a lot of soul searching going on, and people hopefully thinking through, what do we need to do to settle this dispute once and for all, hopefully by peaceful means, before it escalates into something which engulfs all of Ukraine, potentially a fair swath of Eastern Europe, potentially draws in NATO, potentially draws in not just unconventional, but even atomic weapons. Sadly, that's what we're facing now if we don't deal with this.
Yeah, it is. It is quite alarming when you think of how far this could go. Of course, just a couple of weeks ago, before all this happened, Putin was very clear, saying that if there was any foreign intervention into the dispute, that all of the European nations would get drawn into a conflict against their will, and there would be no winners for anyone. And I do feel very alarmed when I see the amount of support that there is for full-on NATO intervention when it comes to this conflict. Now, of course, nobody wants war, and of course, Russia is very much an aggressor in this case, and they've taken things up to the kinetic level. They are obviously by no means innocent in this, but we are seeing a huge amount of support. I was just going through the classic FT comment section over the past few days, and the amount of people who really just want what could only lead ultimately to a nuclear conflict is quite remarkable. I don't think people seem to understand that if NATO were to be brought into this, and it was a NATO on Russia war, I mean, there's very little that would get in the way of this going to a nuclear theater of engagement.
Well,
And
potentially, but the thing is, what bothers me about this, and look, this is my personal opinion, but but what bothers me about this is that actually, it seems to me that there's actually a lot of room to carve out a deal here, and I'm concerned that NATO is so preoccupied with its domestic political realities that it's not necessarily doing what would be most effective when it comes to actually solving this foreign issue, right? Ukraine not itself being part of NATO. The fact is that NATO does have a PR problem. In that, how do you convince relatively wealthy, relatively peaceful West European countries, and of course the United States, that this is their fight? It's not an easy sell, and it's not an easy sell. And so, how do you do it? And clearly, the PR machine has been working overdrive here. I mean, again, I just the way the stories appear as they do in the media, the way the photos appear as they do in the media, some of them have been brought from years past and passed off as contemporary photos of explosions and women and children suffering and whatnot. There's clearly a big PR exercise underway, and I'd be very, very surprised if NATO did not have its hands in that. That doesn't mean it's all misinformation, but clearly there's some misinformation out there, and I'm sure on the Russian side, I'm sure the Russian
yeah,
PR machine is doing its job
they're
too,
both at
right?
it. Yeah,
I mean, gee, if they can manipulate U.S. elections, as some people believe, they can certainly manipulate their own domestic public opinion. So, I mean, again, the first casualty in war is the truth. Okay, but what bothers me specifically about this is that for NATO to escalate the PR campaign the way they have, and yet not having good conventional military options that are viable in eastern and southern Ukraine is a very dangerous game to play. Whereas Russia actually has viable military options in southern and eastern Ukraine, very viable. They have short supply lines, they have tremendous superior of manpower and machinery. They have a cutting edge airplane and missile technology to provide for air support, or at a minimum, deny NATO air superiority, meaning they can operate on the ground more or less as they want to. NATO can't do that in Eastern Ukraine. What Western Ukraine might be a different story. I accept that, especially as you approach the Polish border. That's when the game would really change. But I don't think it's going to come to that. I think we will find a basis for negotiation before that. But the basis is what I kind of just said. The fact is, you're going to have to draw a line somewhere. You're going to have to build a new fence somewhere. And that fence presumably is going to be drawn east of the Dnieper River and or south of the Dnieper River. And Ukraine's just going to have to accept the independence of these Russian-speaking republics. And there can be security guarantees. For example, Russia can sign a security guarantee that they will never arm those republics, that they will never occupy those republics. And Ukraine, in exchange, won't militarize anything east of the Dnieper River, and also will guarantee that it will never join NATO and never again allow NATO to supply it with weapons the way it's been doing recently. So it seems to me there's a deal to be done here, but it's going to require some honesty, some soul searching, and the current PR exercise, certainly in NATO, possibly also in Russia, is not helpful in this regard.
yeah. I certainly hope this PR exercise, as we describe it, doesn't end up going too far, because it feels like public support for military action is now crazy. It's like people haven't really learned anything from Iraq and Afghanistan, and suddenly we're
But do you
all
see
good to
how
go for war
dangerous
again.
it is? You see how dangerous it is. If everyone's pushing for NATO to get militarily involved in eastern Ukraine, but NATO doesn't have good conventional military options, you get on a very steep escalatory slope to unconventional warfare, right?
Certainly, yeah.
And I don't think the general public realizes that. I think the general public somehow thinks that NATO has a huge fleet of tanks that are ready to cross the Dnieper River tomorrow. It's just not true. They don't.
But even if they did, I mean, if NATO did actually start directly fighting Russian troops. I mean, this is full on nuclear state warfare with each other.
Well, that's again, this is the thing, right? Is that the battlefield, again, I stress the battlefield in eastern and southern Ukraine. The battlefield favors Russia. They have the shorter supply lines, they have the greater manpower, they have the greater military experience. And and so NATO is at a disadvantage. Again, as you approach the Polish border, as you approach NATO's own borders, as it were, in the West, the game changes. But in eastern Ukraine, NATO simply is at such a huge disadvantage. They cannot credibly fight without nuclear weapons. And I don't think the general public in NATO countries understand that.
Yeah, no, it's quite horrifying. I really didn't think people would be so keen for nuclear state on nuclear state warfare, but I think maybe people are just so used to the war on terror, and well, we're fighting somebody, and they've kind of forgotten the fact that Al Qaeda never had nuclear weapons, and neither of course did Iraq, though everyone thought they might have WMDs, and they still haven't turned up anywhere. Now, good evening to everybody in the chat. I haven't said good evening to everybody yet. It is great to see you all here. It is some familiar faces in the chat. Good evening, everyone. Doug has just returned home, has just tuned in. Welcome, Doug. It's good to see so many questions in the chat. We shall get to quite a few of these. John, I thought we could, we're on the market consequences of this, because we've been speaking a lot on geopolitics thus far. It would be good to have a kind of a debrief on effectively all that's gone on and why it's happened the way it has. So we're seeing oil over $100. I mean, oil was up $10 today, which is just a crazy thing for oil to be doing in general. And of course, the ruble has seen this extraordinary fall from grace. I think it was down 50% just from where it was in February, which as a national currency, I mean, this is the kind of thing you're used to in cryptocurrency world, but for the ruble, it's quite extraordinary. And one wonders, just how prepared Russia was for all of this, because I think the Russian government is well used to sanctions. They're well used to having sanctions levied on them by other governments. Do you think they were as prepared? Do you think that they anticipated that the response would be such as it has been from the rest of the world when it comes to economic sanctions?
I think they might be surprised just how quickly the rest of the world has kind of got together on this one and rallied around the same sanctions flag. But actually, let's place this in context now. Russia is a huge net exporter, largely because of their huge advantages in natural resources. They have the energy, they have the metals, they have other raw materials that they sell for export. Those markets are not ruble markets. They are dollar markets overwhelmingly. I mean, some's traded in euros for sure, especially if you're dealing with Germany. But really, it's a dollar and to some extent euro market. It's not a ruble market. The ruble can decline. And as long as you're talking about just domestic trade in rubles between Russians, that's not necessarily that big a deal, because from their perspective, the price level is essentially unchanged. The net exports being denominated anyway in dollars, euros, whatever, is actually means that that Russia, in theory, gets as much revenue in real terms as it would be getting anyway. Now, that said, you could say, oh, well, wait a minute. What if the West stops buying Russian oil? What if the West stops buying Russian gas? What if it stops buying Russian metals? Well, okay. I mean, it might come to that, but if it does, the lights go out.
Yeah.
And who has the advantage then? Now, don't get me wrong. I mean, this is painful for everybody. I mean, Russia does need someone, to sell to, but they'll still have China. They'll still have Iran. They'll still have Mongolia. They'll still have a handful of other places in Central Asia. It's not as if they have no customers at all. And of course, when it comes to keeping the lights on, they'll be able to. So I think it's a mistake, in my opinion, to equate this rallying around the sanctions that we're seeing in the West with something that is economically as meaningful for Russia as the West is pretending it is. And isn't it nice to be able to grandstand and say, oh, these are the most comprehensive, devastating sanctions we've ever imposed, but not say we're doing this because we don't really have good military options? Because that's what it is, right? The reason why there's so much emphasis behind the sanctions is because NATO really doesn't have good military options. And so they're playing it up for all it's worth. What is curious, and this is worth a giggle, I certainly hope I get a laugh out of some of our viewers, when the sanctions were being proposed, and they have yet to be fully implemented, of course, this takes time. In some cases, national parliaments need to get together and rubber stamp this stuff. Some carve outs have already put in there. Of course, energy itself apparently is a carve out, right? Germany's not going to allow its energy to be cut off. So that's already been carved out of the sanctions. But another curious one is apparently some French and Italian luxury goods makers have had their handbags and shoes and clothing carved out also because, of course, they depend on wealthy Russians for so much of their exports. Well,
Wow.
gee, this must be really important to NATO if they're going to make certain to defend fancy, shoe and suit and handbag exports to Russia as part of the package. I mean, imagine how much the Russians laugh when they see stuff like that happening. Can they take NATO seriously?
Yeah.
It's hard sometimes.
Yeah, I would love to have just, subtitled, of course. I would have loved to have heard the conversations that took place between the brand ambassadors and the government when they were saying, could we please get an exemption for this, so that while the war is going on, we can still give them some Gucci handbags and things like that. It does, I think it shows a lot of our true colors when, in the face of war, we do this. I think I agree 100% that sanctions are being blown up to, and they're being celebrated as these brutal, crippling things. When I think Russia has very much been prepared for it, and Russia, of course, is very used to this in general. I mean, John, when we're thinking of these really high energy prices, I've got a couple of folks in the chat lamenting the very high energy prices that we're getting here in the UK at the minute. It does feel like this is just going to pour, for lack of a better metaphor, it's going to pour fuel on the flames of the inflation fire that we've seen so far. And to my eyes, and this is just my gut feeling, but I think these high energy prices that we've got now are going to be with us for some time, regardless of how the Ukraine situation evolves. So, and I don't see the Ukraine situation being solved very quickly either. Even in a best case scenario, I think it'll be a very long, drawn out ordeal. Hopefully, with minimal casualties, and that people come to the table, and it's just a staring match ultimately when it comes to the negotiations. I think that would probably be in everybody's best interest. But what's your thoughts on that? Do you think that these high prices that we've seen are just a knee-jerk response, and they'll go down after some peace is agreed, if it is agreed, or are they just
Well,
with us to stay?
that's the thing, right? A peace will have to be agreed. I do think that oil prices, energy prices generally, and certain other commodity prices, take palladium, which is a big Russian export. I think a lot of them will come down if it appears that everyone's beginning to negotiate in good faith to de-escalate this thing. But let's look at what's already happened. This rise in oil prices now, and it's not just today. Today's big, but let's add it up to what was already happening before things kicked off, and indeed the whole past year. The rise in oil prices we've seen now over the past year, and of course, very abrupt rise adding to that in recent days, historically has always, and I don't use superlative words like that frequently, always led to a recession. Always. It's just too big now. This big oil price rise we've seen now is a supply shock, and it will lead to demand destruction, as economists call it. What that means is you're just going to eat into the profit margins of the economy. Businesses will have to scale back operations. Consumers will have to scale back consumption. Everyone's going to have to try to save more. There's no escaping a recession now. There's just not. The numbers are too big. It's been too big a rise. And fine, if it all reversed tomorrow, then maybe it wouldn't happen. But the problem is if you just reverse the recent rise tomorrow, and not the whole year-on-year rise that we've seen, which is huge, you're going to get a recession. And I would think that smart economists advising NATO, and NATO does have economists advising it, are telling NATO, look, if you're going to try to maintain the military momentum here, be aware that your domestic populations are going to be plunged into recession over the coming months, and understand what that means for your PR exercise, for your PR effort. It's harder to sell a war during a recession than it is during a boom. And it's a luxury of the United States' war on terror, and also that of a few other countries that have participated, that they've been able to prosecute those wars while goosing their economies with various forms of monetary and fiscal stimulus. That's not going to work here. The oil price shock is simply too big. Recession is unavoidable. And sure, you can throw some money at it, but it's not going to be enough. It won't. So that's staring NATO countries in the face. We're going into a recession now.
I'll play devil's advocate here, John, and say the past 2 years of COVID lockdowns, everybody working from home. This means that we are now much more insulated from fuel price shocks than previously because people aren't driving around so much. There's way more working from home. There are loads of people who are still working from home, even when they can go into the office. They're not driving to work, not commuting so much. At the same time, there hasn't been so much of a demand for foreign travel still because there's still all of the restrictions on so many of it. Could this be enough to prevent a recession caused by an oil price spike?
I doubt it. I doubt it. I mean, you're right to bring this up, Boaz, absolutely. But I doubt it. And the reason why is there are too many industries, what I call fundamental or foundational industries, that really do require people to actually go to work. Hence why we had all those supply and logistical issues build up
In
during
the
the
first
COVID
place.
period. I mean, are we going to go right back to that? I mean, if we do, then the situation will only be worse than before, because not only do we go back to de facto lockdown, even if it's not legally mandated, you go back to de facto lockdown, and yet you still have the disruptions associated with the war in Eastern Europe. So it ends up being even worse, and you get even more a bigger negative supply shock, and yet all the money that's been thrown around during COVID is not available now, right? It's been spent. Interest rates were already on the way up, and so now you're in an even deeper mess, I believe. So I think recession is unavoidable, notwithstanding your arguments there.
Right. Yeah, I definitely agree. I don't feel that the world has changed quite so much in the last 2 years that it makes it immune to oil, though, as much as many folks would like to think so. It is interesting, though, of course, when you have this oil price issue, that oil producing countries, of course, have it pretty good. They see an inverse effect because, of course, there's so much more money flowing around their own economies. Russia, of course, being one of them. As John in the chat says, oil and gas goes up. Russia quids in as long as there's a market. Most of Russian energy, apart from transport, is supplied by hydropower. And also there's a comment here on how when aren't energy prices self-righting? This is from David, who says fracking suddenly becomes economically viable again, especially in the US and in Canada. So we would see, of course, a lot more supply come to the market, the higher and for the longer that these oil price rises are sustained for. But at the same time, you still, turning on oil supply, even if you are fracking, it does take you a little bit of time.
Yeah,
And even in places like Canada with the tar sands, which were absolutely brutalized by the COVID lockdowns, it takes a very, very long time to get those up and running again.
that's right. Oil wells are not simply a switch that you turn on and off. Oddly enough, gas is easier to turn on and off, but oil is not. And yes, absolutely. I mean, eventually you're going to get new production and new investment in new fields, entire new fields, if prices stay this elevated. But that's the longer run effect. The shorter run effect is the demand destruction I mentioned. So you've got to get to the other side first, and we're going to go through a period of essentially zero or negative economic growth until we get to the other side, and that could be a year or more away.
Yeah, there are, of course, there are so many potential outcomes. If we could maybe try and distill it down to sort of a binary where the war continues and there continues to be very savage fighting, the tensions remain just as high as they are between NATO and Russia, and the media keeps up with the war rhetoric, and everyone feels like we're going to, we're on the brink of either an apocalypse or another world war or something like that. And then another scenario where peace is achieved. There's plenty of tension still, but there is still at least peace. I know this is a very big ask, John, but would you be able to give scenarios for how things like energy react from one of those circumstances to the other? Because if we did get peace, would energy prices really come down very quickly? Or just in general, looking at the markets. So we could look on the commodity side, for example. Which way do they go in either scenario?
Well, I think energy would give up its recent gains when it's clear, and hopefully it will soon become clear that negotiations are replacing outright warfare. And so what that means is, oil is going to settle back into sort of the $80 range fairly quickly if that happens. Whether it drifts lower from there will, be due to the more normal macroeconomic factors, as it were. That said, even if you're at a level such as that, I mean, keep in mind, again, oil was creeping higher before this kicked off, and it was creeping higher for more normal macroeconomic reasons.
Yes.
As you pointed out, I mean, the world was recovering from COVID. And things were beginning to normalize somewhat. I mean, after all, central banks were beginning to raise interest rates, so on and so forth. So I think that would happen fairly quickly, but it's not clear quite what would then happen next. When it comes to other commodity prices, including agriculture, let's face it, Ukraine's a breadbasket. And so it does matter when it comes to soft commodity prices. And it's no surprise to me or other informed observers that the major grains prices have also risen very, very sharply in recent days. Now, in percentage terms, not as much as oil, but again, keep in mind, they have generally been in an uptrend over the past year. So yes, they would probably give up some of those recent gains, but they wouldn't necessarily fall back to where they were before the general global inflation kicked in under COVID lockdowns. And then when it comes to things like industrial metals, hugely macroeconomic. Some of them, of course, are related to the whole EV investment craze, and others are more just general, always in demand metals such as copper or aluminium or something like that. Those are harder to read because if we are going into a recessionary period, I don't think that those will remain elevated either. I think they'll come down more or less in line with energy, give up their recent gains, and then follow sort of the usual variables thereafter. That said, if this continues to escalate, I mean, all bets are off. And I hate to say this, but you realize beyond a certain point, if this thing escalates, Russia turns the taps off. No more energy is going to be flowing into Western Europe that is not delivered by sea, and that's a fairly frightening prospect. And that will be so disruptive for the entire world that it will infect everything, right? Absolutely everything. And that to me that's a real nightmare if it comes to that. I don't think it will. I don't think Germany Inc. is going to allow itself to be bankrupted over this dispute. I really, really don't. Germany Inc. is way too successful, way too powerful, way too politically organized, and they will tell the Chancellor of Germany, Scholz, and others when it's time to go to the negotiating table. In my opinion, I have a lot of faith in Germany to be a critical party in helping to sort this out.
Yeah, one certainly hopes there will be level heads at the table, even if the media is telling us not to be level headed. There's a comment here from Michael, which I find quite interesting, saying, "Yes, recession is inevitable in Europe, but this is an affront by Russia on civilized behavior in the 21st century. We are already seeing that people will unite and accept the hardship ahead." Well, the thing is, Michael, I'm not sure people know what the hardship ahead will actually be. So if we do get, for example, as John describes, Russia simply turns off the gas, and there are enormous power blackouts throughout Europe. I'm not sure people are prepared for that. I don't think that's I don't think people understand the consequences of what they're demanding. But hopefully it won't have to come to that, and we won't see this kind of response. I mean, John, what's your thoughts on that? Do you think, in terms of the hardship ahead and the will of the citizenry, having gone through COVID, they're prepared for more draconian rules enforced on themselves in order for freedom to exist, as described by the press in Ukraine?
I mean, again, the PR campaign here is doing extremely well, and obviously, I mean, the basic right of a people to self determination is something that I think almost all civilized people can agree upon. We want to be able to make our own choices as individuals, as families, as groups, as communities, and as ethnic groups and countries, and most of us can identify with that. And so in Ukraine, the way it's being spun by NATO, it's as if Ukraine is a homogenous entity, ethnically and culturally, when it's not. It's just not. And that's, again, that's part of the misunderstanding and part of the problem here. Now, as long as NATO keeps up that sort of PR campaign, then yeah, freedom-loving people around the world who believe in self-determination will continue to support Ukraine, but only up to a point. Everyone has their pain threshold. How high do petrol prices have to go? How many days of rolling blackouts do you have to endure? How many families will be willing to make material cutbacks in the quality of food that they feed their children, before they change their mind about some of this stuff? And don't get me wrong. I mean, it's amazing what the Brits and others endured in the 20th century in terms of hardship, and they weren't even the primary battlefield. I mean, I don't want to belittle the Blitz for one moment, but come on, you can't compare it to what was happening in Ukraine and what was happening in other parts that were part of the Stalin versus Hitler battlefield during those years. Um, I mean, there is a limit to the hardship that people will endure. And keep in mind, we live in the era of the welfare state, where we expect the government to be able to provide a huge range of services to us in exchange for what are historically extremely high tax rates. If you're still paying those extremely high tax rates, but you're not getting a whole lot in return, politicians don't tend to last very long in those sorts of situations unless they become outright dictators. And I really don't think the West wants to go down that road. And so at some point, right, these welfare states that comprise the bulk of NATO are going to have a very frank national conversation with themselves, whether they want to sacrifice their welfare state, sacrifice their democracy, sacrifice their liberal, open, tolerant political traditions in order to fight a war against Russia, because that's what the choice eventually comes down to.
Indeed. And Michael says, we will see. We'll see, Boaz, as to whether or not, the citizens of the West will be happy to put up with all manner of issues if that means doing what it takes to fight for Ukraine's safety. There's a comment here from Shanif, which I find quite reflective of the current environment, and something I find quite very worrying. Putin is like a modern day Hitler. The only difference is Putin has nukes. Now, I find this comparison kind of troubling. It's somewhat ironic in a way, given the fact that I believe Ukraine actually absorbed what was originally a neo-Nazi militia, the Azov Battalion, formally into its military structure back in 2014. So these guys wear, SS runes on their uniform. I understand there's a portrait of Hitler in their barracks. And all the folks who were saying, when we're thinking of a liberal Western democracy, we obviously don't think of people who really liked Hitler wearing uniforms and carrying guns. And yet here we are. And all of the papers want us to think that, everyone in the Ukrainian military is a great person who reflects Western values. And, seeing these descriptions of Putin as Hitler, I don't think they're very helpful, and I don't think they're very reflective of reality. However, we are getting outside of our general remit when it comes to investment markets. There are loads of questions that we could go to on this. I think it's a very interesting one. If I just scroll through, we are getting loads. Thank you for all the comments, folks. It is great to see so much engagement from this. And it's good to do these live as ever, because there's nothing quite like having a live conversation. This one's from Alice. Very good question. Why is India staying so quiet? I find it's a very, very good question. I think, from my side, John, I'm sure there's plenty more expertise. Like, from my brief understanding of it, India is much more concerned about China than it is about Russia. And of course, Russia supplies much of India's arms. So you'll find plenty of Indian soldiers carrying modern equivalents of AK-47s. And I believe they have S-400, missile launchers as well, which of course are very politically sensitive as they're used against very advanced fighter jets. And as a result, for India to move back against Russia in a big way, it thinks would make India worse off vis-a-vis China, because Russia and China, of course, are quite close as well. John, what would be your take on that?
Look, in recent decades, India has behaved more or less like a classic neutral power. They're willing to deal with anyone. They're willing to play anyone off against someone else for a better deal. they have a sense of their own national interest, and they're well aware that that national interest does not align seamlessly with any of the other big players in Eurasia, nor any of the big players globally, including the United States. India has in the past had material border disputes with China, and that gives them a reason to remain reasonably tight with Russia. Also, keep in mind, the whole India-Pakistan history. It's not lost on anyone that Pakistan and China have themselves been relatively tight through the decades as Pakistan emerged as an independent country. And so India's had kind of a double reason, as it were, to be reasonably close to Russia at times. Because, of course, if you look at a map, you realize that they're kind of sandwiched between China and Pakistan, and Russia provides a potential lifeline. Also, India doesn't have much in the way of domestic oil sources. And so India really depends on freedom of navigation in the Indian Ocean, something which the Chinese are keen to have some influence upon, not just the South China Sea, where we know China's really ramped up the pressure, but in the Indian Ocean, in part because China has growing natural resource mineral rights in Africa that have been developed with its alliances with various African nations. And India also relies on a lot of this. And so India's got a difficult game to play here. And I think that the best thing for them to do, again, I'm putting my sort of my hat on and trying to think in India's own national interest here, is to continue being neutral, continue being flexible, and not to get into some entangling alliance that compromises their ability to maneuver and their room for maneuver as situations and conditions warrant. So that I think is it helps to explain perhaps why things are unfolding here the way they are.
Yeah, I mean, just the border disputes you mentioned between India and China. I mean, those disputes still exist, and they heated up a bit last year, and I'm no doubt they will, heat up again as this goes forward, and India and China both become stronger and start flexing a little bit more. Good question from Nicholas. This is from our Facebook stream. Says, "I heard Russia has the same size economy as Spain. Will they run out of money?" It's a good question, Nicholas, because obviously these are, wars are enormously expensive enterprises, conventional wars especially, and surely Russia has factored this into their calculations. John, what do you think? What kind of measures do you think Russia might turn to in order to gain access to more money just to keep funding this?
Russia does have options, and notwithstanding, again, the rhetoric around the sanctions packages being put together, Russia has more options than is generally acknowledged. Again, their relationship with China is at the point where they really don't need access to the broader international financial system to be able to transact with China. The same is true of the Central Asian republics. In theory, you have this bloc in Asia, which comprises a large portion of the so-called Shanghai Cooperation Organization, or SCO, which is also associated with the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. There's a lot of trade that can happen there that really does not depend on the dollar, on SWIFT, or on direct ties to Western banks. There are ways around it. There's also the fact that, in a way, Russia does have a currency, and they actually have the ability to print it, and that's oil and gas. I mean, I'm stretching it a bit here, but the fact is, oil will always find a bidder. Look, you can try to sanction it all day long, but too many people need oil. And someone's going to step up and say, okay, fine, we might do this under the table, but we're going to enter into an oil contract with you. And in order to evade sanctions, we won't deal in dollars, we won't deal in euros, we'll deal in something. And indeed, that something could almost be a barter arrangement. I mean, you can see Russia, because they've got this oil, because they've got this gas, and the pipeline network's much bigger than it used to be vis-a-vis Central Asia. You could see Russia opportunistically cutting deals to kind of get it through the crisis here, and of course any customer for those materials would be a happy customer, because everyone's desperate for energy. So Russia actually has that to its advantage. And again, imagine it. I just can't believe that if the EU and NATO completely cut off Russian energy exports, what going westwards, I mean, the lights really do go out. And they really do. I mean, I don't see another scenario there. So I think Russia has a stronger negotiating position and stronger flexibility when it comes to sanctions than I believe is being fairly presented. It's being unfairly presented in most of the Western press.
Yeah, no one wants to admit it because that would make Russia look like it had a stronger hand, and of course, nobody wants people to think that. But of course, that leads to people having unrealistic ideas of what can and can't be done, and what the consequences may or may not be. As Roger comments, we are all still heavily dependent on oil. Indeed, Roger, and as a proud Aberdonian, long may that continue. Though, of course, my colleagues here at Southbank Investment Research would disagree with me. We are getting a bit on for time, John, and this has been a great conversation thus far. But there are a few other questions I think we should cover. I'll just go straight to it. This one's from Doug, again from earlier, who just managed to get in the nick of time. John is convinced a recession is on its way. When does he predict this will happen? And what will happen to current share prices? More important, what type of stocks will be hit most? Very good question indeed, Doug. Yeah, John, if we are going to get a recession as a result of the oil price spike, when's it going to be?
All right, well, let's get practical. First of all, the recession may have already started. It is possible. Leading indicators were already not looking exactly great when we got into this situation, and I suspect again this big shock in energy prices is going to have fairly quick results. So at the latest, I think it will be recognized in the official data, which only ever arrives with a lag. I think by the latest, it will be recognized we've slipped into recession during the second quarter of this year at the latest. It could be happening right now. Okay. That's the quick answer to that question. Moving on to what it means for investors. If you're entering into what is effectively a stagflationary recession, that is a recession that is largely, not entirely, but largely the result of negative supply shocks, what you really want to do is be careful what you do in the stock market, because if you simply get out and sit in cash, you're going to suffer the inflation, but you're not going to benefit from those firms and those sectors that historically do disproportionately well in that set of conditions. What you want to do to protect yourself from inflation is you still want to be invested in companies that have revenues that grow with inflation, margins that remain stable in inflation. Those tend to be natural resource companies. They tend to be companies that I always say are low on the value chain, raw economic input, raw commodities processing, basic chemicals, basic materials, things that may be very low margin businesses, but at least the margins are stable. Because it's when you get into the more exotic, discretionary, trendy, sexy products that, of course, we love to buy, or services we love to indulge in, that's where the pricing power is lost very, very quickly when times get tough. So you want to invest low on the economic value chain. You want to avoid areas high on the economic value chain, even though they might be, trendy and cool and all of that. You just have to say, hey, I'm going to buy, that gravel company instead. I
Yep.
mean, that really, very, or that company that recycles waste, that company that picks up the garbage, that company that unblocks the pipes, and keeps the water running. These sorts of things, right? Basic industries that keep the lights on, that keep the water flowing, that keep things sanitary, that put food on the table. That's where you want to be invested right now. Defensive, but defensive in a way that protects you from inflation, because the margins may be low, but they're stable and they're dependable, and they remain so in an inflationary environment and even in a recession.
Very, very, very sage advice, John. Of course, as you say, it's not the sexiest proposition when you're looking at waste disposal and some of the raw input, gravel manufacturing. Though, of course, there have been grand fortunes made in gravel. There's an interesting aside here. Of course, when you're looking low on the value chain, you're looking at commodities, basic inputs. Of course, a lot of that, you can find quite a few of those in the Russian stock market, which of course has been absolutely obliterated. Well, it's not obliterated. Well, I mean, it's down 24% at the time of us recording this, and over the course of since February, ultimately. And of course, a lot of people see we need to boycott Russia. But of course, if we're just doing this as a hypothetical exercise, John, I remember on a previous episode when we talked about what would you do, what would your trade be if Russia did invade Ukraine, and I believe you said, well, you'd buy the Russian stock market. What are your thoughts on that?
I still believe that's right. I mean, you buy when there's blood in the streets, and sadly, and again, I please don't take this the wrong way. There is blood in the streets. I don't want to give anyone the wrong impression. This is a tragedy. It's a tragedy for everyone involved, and it shouldn't be happening. And I'm sad it is. But I'm not the one who came up with that quote.
Nope.
And the fact is, the Russian stock market has been absolutely massacred by this. And to see it as deep value now does not require one to pass any moral judgment whatsoever. You can still think Russia are the bad guys, and you can still think big tobacco are the bad guys, or big pharma, or big anything else, and yet think that their stocks are good value. If you're just trying to look through this as a rational investor who's not making a moral judgment, you absolutely buy the Russian stock market here. I think it's a huge opportunity. But please, no one think that means I think Russia are somehow the good guys in this, or that I think that we should all start waving Russian flags around. I just think, as an investor, that is the opportunity. It's staring you in the face.
Certainly, if we are discussing this, purely from a markets perspective, when we're just looking at numbers going up and down on a screen, and you're playing this like a game, you don't need to think of it in such a moral standard. Of course, the purpose of the show is not to give financial advice; it is simply to discuss the markets for informational and occasionally entertainment purposes. We are getting a little on for time. A couple more, if we can, in the last 5 minutes, John. If we're just thinking of where we are with China at the minute, a lot of people thinking China is going to be kind of emboldened by this, and maybe they're going to be working to broker some kind of peace deal, given their closeness with Russia and allowing Russia to skirt a lot of the economic sanctions that have been levied on them. Where do you think that's going? What do you think the CCP are thinking about when they're seeing this happen? Do they see this as an opportunity?
Look, I'm going to make an extremely cynical comment here, okay? But it's one that look. If I were China, and if I believed that I was the world's rising power, that I was becoming the world's largest economy, that someday I would have the world's largest military, I already have the world's largest population, the best thing that could happen to me, the one that would make me really think that I was destined for greatness, would be for Russia and NATO to go to war. I mean, how convenient. I mean, let the other two biggest rivals in Eurasia, I mean, because NATO obviously is a Eurasian entity, notwithstanding the US component, let them beat each other's brains out for a year. Let them spend, let them waste, blood, money, and treasure and everything else, while we continue to consolidate our influence over the South China Sea, over East Asia and the Western Pacific generally, over the Indian Ocean, maybe take another big piece of African influence away from whoever else is still there, like France or the US. I'd be chomping at the bit if I were China. I'd think this was so great. I'd be passing the popcorn around, but I'd be trying not to show that on the international stage. That's what I'd be doing if I were China. And I hate to say it, but it almost makes you wonder whether they've had some behind the scenes influence on precisely how events have turned out here.
Yeah, that's a very interesting take on it, John. And ultimately, we don't know what goes on behind closed doors, of course. But everyone watching can, of course, see where John is coming from there. Ultimately, if you were just wanting to be king of the hill, seeing your biggest rivals beat each other up and spend all their money on it would probably do you pretty well. Unless, of course, it went nuclear, which hopefully it won't. Stephen in the chat says, this beating the drum to war must stop. It can only lead to disaster for us all. Very, very wise words, Stephen. We're with you 100%. One last thing, John, if we can, in the last couple of minutes. If we're looking at gold at the minute, we have seen quite a few comments in the chat regarding gold. It does feel like it's having, people are finally remembering what the whole gold thing was about. It's funny. It's a sad that it takes this kind of event for people to do that, but gold having an interesting spike at the minute. What's your thoughts on it going forward?
Well, I'm surprised I got through this whole hour without commenting on gold. So
Well
thanks for
done.
bringing it up. When I was talking earlier about Russia having options when it comes to trying to evade sanctions, obviously gold is useful in that regard. I mentioned barter because gold is not an official money in the world today. That does not mean it can't be used for barter because, again, pretty much anyone is willing to use that in exchange for vital resources. It is recognized as money, even if it's not official money. So Russia's very large gold reserves could be mobilized to help them deal with the situation, in particular when there are liquidity issues and direct barter arrangements are difficult to come by. Also, and this is something I'm not predicting, but it would almost be fitting if it happened this way. If things sadly don't get resolved soon, and if the sanctions really do begin to bite, and if it gets to the point where Russia is simply withholding any and all energy exports to the EU and NATO countries, um, one of the simplest things Russia could do would be to come out and say, look, we're terribly sorry you got all these sanctions on us, but actually, as it happens, if you're willing to buy our oil and gas in gold, we'll take the gold in exchange. That would be an interesting card to play. And I'm not predicting it happens, but it would almost be fitting and it would teach a lesson to all of us just how important the behind the scenes role of gold has been all this time. Because then it would become the suddenly most important currency of all for countries that have basically disparaged it for years. And I think it's almost a fitting comeuppance for the hubris of much of the Western world that they'd have to cough up the gold just to keep the lights on as a result of this.
A very interesting idea. I think it's I can believe it. Hopefully, of course, we don't get to the point where Russia does just turn off the energy, of course, because that would lead to all manner of chaos, civil unrest, and no doubt further conflict. But we shall have to call it there, folks. We shall end on that bombshell from John. This has been a very good stream as ever, John. Thanks so much for joining me.
My pleasure.
There you have it, folks. That was episode 33 of Southbank Live. Hope you enjoyed it. Thanks to everybody who tuned in. If you did enjoy it, do give us a like and subscribe. That really does help us out. And if you're watching a recording and you have any questions you'd like to ask in future episodes, do leave them as a comment. Once again, thanks to everybody who tuned in this evening. This was an emergency episode just because everything going on in Ukraine is so important to everybody. There's very few investors out there who haven't been somehow influenced by what's going on in Ukraine. And I've no doubt that as the situation unfolds, we'll see yet more of that in the future. We shall be back again on Thursday. Kit Winder will be back to tell us all about New World investing and how things like renewable energy may change the game going forward. I'll be speaking to him again on Thursday, and that will be at 7 p.m. once again. So just in a couple of days. That's all for the moment. Thanks for tuning in, folks, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.